Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
This is The Curious Collector. I'm Stuart Holbrook, back here with you for a new episode. Today, we're going to be talking about the COVID effect on collecting, and an interesting topic kind of going back. Can you believe it's been 5 years? We'll get into that in a few minutes. First, just giving you an update of my current location as I do every episode. Today, I am home. Yes, I'm home. I actually made it home. My vehicle left late February and just got back home for the first time since then. Now, I've been back a few times for auctions, events, and other things, of course, along the way. But I made it back home for a few days, and now I am starting to jump on some planes to do some other work mixed in with my doll club talks, table talks that I'm doing around the country. Headed to San Diego, working with a collection there. Then it's off to Chicago, where I have a couple of doll talks, including a really special one I'm excited about. It's Mary Willandi's Doll Club, and who many of you may know, great collector out of the Chicagoland area. And this happens to be a mix blended in dad-daughter weekend. So Kinley's coming along with me. Can't believe it, but she's turning 17 soon. Because she's enduring my being gone so much doing these doll talks, I thought, well, maybe she should come see what I'm actually talking about and doing, and seeing the interaction with collectors. It is really wonderful and a great experience. So she's coming with me to Chicago for a dad-daughter weekend. We're going to have a great time there. And then I'm moving down to Australia and have some work in Australia for some days, and then up to Tokyo, and then back home. And that'll put me within a week or two of the National Convention, an incredible auction event coming up on July 20th. It's part of the convention in Norfolk, Virginia, we're really excited about as well. So a lot going on. I'm having a great time. I'm feeling really recharged after being home and ready for this next round before we hit the doldrums of August. And hope everybody's been having a great summer out there in collecting land across the world. So I want to introduce today a story about COVID that I think really sums up the weirdness of that period. Now, it was a hard time for a lot of people. And let's not mince words. And I witnessed it across the world, because while everybody else was staying home, I was out there in the field getting dolls because I had to. But before we get into all of that, the story I want to tell you that I think summarizes all of COVID and the wildness that we were discussing here a minute ago is the Great Chinese Seed Conspiracy. And this is the most wild, crazy story I think I ever read relating to COVID. I mentioned this, I believe, in a previous podcast, so you probably had a little snippet of it, but let me just go into a little more details as to exactly what occurred. So some of you might have read during COVID how about 6 months to 8 months into the COVID period in late 2020, all of these Chinese-made garden seeds started showing up at people's doorsteps. And everybody was bewildered. What are these seeds? I never ordered these. And so they started calling local authorities. They started calling local reporters. And people started saying, this is a conspiracy of some sort. The Chinese are sending us seeds to invade our gardens. I have no idea, but I mean, it was just wild with the conspiracies that were coming out during this period about these seeds. So a reporter for The Atlantic decided they really needed to do a deep dive into figuring out the mystery of the Chinese seeds. So he spent about 2 or 3 months, and I think you can find this article still, it's behind a paywall. He found that through a bunch of research, going through Amazon records, talking and interviewing a lot of these people who had received these seeds on their doorstep, he uncovered the reality as being not quite as dramatic as everyone thought. People had actually ordered them. People had ordered those seeds. They just forgot about it. People were ordering so much stuff on Amazon and other sites that the seeds were 50 cents a packet, 60 cents a packet. And in some cases, they were ordering gardening items that the Chinese company would include the seeds as a bonus, but the seeds were back ordered. So they sent them out separately later on. And people just didn't get it, didn't correlate it, didn't remember ordering these things. And it was all real. It was not a conspiracy. I remember reading this article and I was waiting and waiting as I'm reading on to find out that there was some great dramatic reason behind this. And no, it was as simple as that. So to me, that story sums up all the wildness of the COVID times and will lead into our discussion later on about the marketplace and how much people were buying and engaging online during COVID. But let's go back to talking about collecting and COVID times. I witnessed a lot of what people were going through and talked to people and felt their loneliness at the time. But I also really understood a lot of the funny stories that were occurring, odd stories during this time, because we all went a little crazy. Okay, we kind of went a lot crazy, and there were some strange things that occurred. And I'm going to talk a lot about this in relationship to the doll market and really to collecting in general, because it was widespread throughout the collecting world, all of the incredible changes that happened, especially between 20 and 2022. But paradigm shifts that occurred as a result of all of this, which have led to things being different even today. There's no doubt that for generations, we will be talking about the pre-COVID years and the post-COVID years and how much those 2 years of 20 to 22 shaped an entire new generation or two or three in the way we, in this case, collect, what we do, how we do it, how we travel, everywhere we go. Everything changed with COVID. And so we're going to talk about that in respect to collecting, because I think it's a really interesting topic. A lot of you experienced it as well, making it a rather interesting cross-section of personal experiences, I think, that every collector had in their own unique moments within those 2 years that would shape them for the future. So yeah, everything is personal and everybody has their own personal COVID story. So I thought I would share a little bit of mine and how I navigated through this and all of the things that led up to it and how we were able to continue Theriault's and promote doll collecting and engagement with auctions during this time, because it certainly came with panic in the beginning. I mean, let's not mince words. I think everybody was panicked, and I will never forget. So going back, I remember in January of 2020, we had our 50th anniversary celebration in Santa Barbara at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and our huge January auction event. And people flew in from around the world, and we were all together, and it was this perfect environment in which nobody really knew what was coming next. There had been a few little articles about this strange virus in China at that point, and people really hadn't paid much attention to it until later in that month. So I think about that auction a lot, and that auction was, how do I say it? For a lot of people, the irony of it being the 50th anniversary of Theriault's mixed in with the fact that it would be, in many respects, the last auction of a different era, the last type of auction that still lived in a different time, in a different era, and that is pre-COVID, when people came, crowds came, people shared, there was community, we all hugged each other, we all had a blast. And I wish, there are times I often think about that weekend and wish I could go back in time to just relive it once more, just to feel the energy of that room and what it meant to me. And I might have just hugged a few more people, and I might have had a few more drinks with you in the bar, and I might have told a few more stories if I knew that that would be it. That would be the last moment of the old ways pre-COVID. So we got into February, and I never forget, in February of that year, later in February. Now things really started coming out about COVID, and you started seeing all the cases pop up in Italy and different places. And where did I happen to be? In Italy and in Europe, and was actually getting collections. And I will say in the US, it wasn't quite as big a story as it was in Europe at the time. And I was packing up, I'll never forget, a large collection in Lucerne, Switzerland at the time. And it was really in the news everywhere. And I was beginning to wonder what's going on. And that was when I first started seeing people on the street wearing masks, which was never a thing that I saw outside of Asia. So it was clear something was going on. I finished up that work in Europe, and I remember getting on the plane and flying out of Frankfurt to Washington. And this is a flight I'm regularly on. And I'll never forget that I got on that flight. It is typically always full, packed, and it was about 50% full. And I said to the flight attendant, I said, I've never seen this flight like this. And he said, the cancellations are pouring in, and all because of COVID. You know, it still had not resonated with me, the effect that this was having. And then I got home, and within a week or two, I took to the road, and I remember going down to Florida where I was getting some collections and meeting with some different collectors. And that's when all heck broke loose. And I'll remember being in Florida, and I remember all of the rumors that were starting to come out. And this is getting into March now, that the country was going to shut down. The borders were going to close. And I still remember getting in my car and saying, I've got to get home. I can't get stranded here. And so I began to take to the road, and it was nonstop traffic jam on I-95 all the way from Florida to Washington. And it was all Canadians. Every license plate was from Canada, because they had made announcements that there's a very good possibility that Canada was going to close the border in a few days. So if you want home, you better come home now. So it was incredible. And I remember finally getting home. And at this point, we had made the decision, because we had an auction scheduled in Naples, Florida, our annual winter event we do every year in Naples. And we had to make the decision to cancel that auction, because it was impossible to risk our staff or our customers all coming together when the cases were starting to happen here in the US as well. And this is where it began. 2 years where we had sales within our makeshift, at the time, gallery. We now have a full built-out gallery, but a makeshift gallery where we typically did rendezvous auctions, and we had to conduct our major marquee sales. We weren't just going to stop selling dolls, and we wanted to continue doing the auctions, and it seemed like we were the only ones able to really do it at the time. I had luckily had 6 to 7 months of collections backed up here in our warehouse. So we had the goods. We just needed to figure out a way to do the auction. So we mounted in that March, the first time, a marquee cataloged auction in which there would be no audience, no crowd. And it was a time of panic for me, because anybody who ran a business, especially a small business like Theriault, you really do tend to have sleepless nights sometimes when you have big moments like COVID, especially COVID, which really came with no roadmap as far as what to expect, how long this would last, or how serious it would be. You heard one group saying one thing, another group saying another thing, and the end result being nobody knew anything. So it was a definite period of, let's call it anxiety for sure, for any small business owner at that time. But we had to do it. So we tried it. We launched this auction, the first time ever, full-on studio sale, no audience, and it was a hit. People came, they bid, they loved it, they had fun, and there was no noticeable difference whatsoever in anything that we were doing. And probably for me, it was the most difficult of anyone. And that is because, as you all know who have grown up with me in collecting and seen me on the stage over the years in the past, you know how I feed off of a crowd, how I feel the energy, and how much I love being on the stage and engaging with everyone in my passion for a show. And so to put me now in front of a camera with no audience, No commentary, no laughter, no smiles, no drama. I've just got Luke on the phones and Janet sitting back there monitoring and Angel in accounting doing the clerking, and that's it. And so I had to figure out, can I even do this? Can I actually be engaging up there without the interaction of the crowd? It was hard the first time. I will not lie. It was not easy. I was thinking, my gosh, I need like one of those canned laughter things. And maybe Luke could just press the button every time I make a joke and that would make me feel better. But we never did that because I started getting into the swing of things. By the second or third auction, I was really going at it. And I had to figure out a way, how can I take all of my years on the podium, channel that into my memory bank, and create an environment of which I saw you all there in my mind's eye. And I felt your energy and the feeling of like you were there. So I started getting kind of good at it. And I started actually getting feedback from people after the auction that made me realize I was nailing it somehow or another with no audience whatsoever. People were having fun at home watching this. And this was a really telling moment for me when we had this woman who called in on the Monday after a big marquee weekend in which we were in the studio with no audience, broadcasting live. And she called to register a complaint that she was not allowed to come to this auction. And she is really livid, as she was told that we only do studio sales right now during COVID. We don't have an audience. And she watched that auction and she could tell Stuart had to have an audience out there. He had to. There's no way he could have done that or been like that with nobody in the room. We were trying to convince her. We swear to you, there was nobody in the room. It was only me and Luke and Janet doing the phones. So it was really funny. And I guess that was proof positive that I was doing something right along those lines. The hard part in all of this, interestingly enough, was not the selling. The customers were there. The customers wanted to buy. People were collecting, and we'll talk about the market spike during this COVID period a little bit later. There were plenty of people to buy. The problem came to be as we worked through this backlog of items going to auction, worked through these consignments that we took just prior to COVID, we were suddenly facing by June, I would say, a concern of where are we going to get things? Nobody was calling to sell collections. Nobody was calling to say, hey, can you come talk to me about my dolls? And I'm possibly thinking of selling. Even estates where people were passing away, the heirs were not even opening up or wanting to do anything at that point. It was kind of twofold. It was one, as I said, people didn't want you in their house. And two, people had this perception at the time that the market must be absolutely horrible because of COVID. When the reality, as we'll talk about a little bit later, was actually the opposite. What happened was an absolutely massive influx of new collectors came into the market, and there wasn't enough stuff on the market to go around. Dealers had very little. Auction houses had very little. There was hardly anything coming out in any of the platforms whatsoever. And Theriault seemed to be one of the few places that was having a steady stream of dolls because of our backlog. But I knew I was hitting a crossroads. Either I get out there on the road and I find more merchandise, or by the fall, early fall, we're going to be in trouble. We can't sell from an empty cart. It's a lot like any business, I would say, in that you got customers and you have a product. That part's the same. The difference being our product, we don't just pick up the phone and place an order for 500 of these or 200 of those. I wish it was that easy, believe me. Our entire business relies on the rotation and movement of objects that we have to go out and not order, we have to find. And so the hunt is very much alive for me as it is for the collector. It's the same hunt. And so I needed to go hunting. And I needed to take to the road. At the time when everybody was staying at home, nobody wanted to get out there. The highways were empty. The flights were empty. I mean, I remember driving through Chicago in like June of that year, And literally, it was a ghost town. I mean, I would get on a highway that was normally backed up for an hour trying to get into the city, and I was zooming in at about 80 miles an hour, and I was the only person on the road. It was eerie. It was very strange time to be traveling. It was strange checking into a hotel, and there was just one person asleep at the desk, and there were no guests whatsoever. I was the only one living on DoorDash. I'm telling you, I ordered more DoorDash in my life during those 2 years than any person out there. It was incredible. And then, of course, because the homes I did get into, I was always really concerned for everyone's safety. And I was out on the road and in the trenches. And, I didn't want to be bringing COVID in to anyone out there that I was seeing. And a lot of these collectors could be elderly. So I was regularly getting tested. And this is not the period when you could go buy the disposable tests in CVS. This was the period where you had to literally go find a place and get testing. And sometimes it took 24 hours. So I would be getting tested like 2-3 times a week at these drive-through places or these pull-up clinics and waiting to get it all clear and then going into the collector home, seeing them and just giving them some reassurance. So during that 2-year period, I assure you, no one was tested for COVID more than me. And then there was that anxiety that you had out on the road. And it wasn't just like little hit trips, I call them, where I was just running out to Buffalo and getting some dollars and running home. I was going full out across America. And the only way to do it effectively at that point was to drive. It was just too difficult flying. And it was really kind of risky at that point, pre-vaccination, trying to figure out flights. And a lot of the flights had been pared down. There were very few to get anymore. And so I just took to the road and drove. And I was driving all the way across to California, down through Texas, over to Florida, everywhere, all across the country. Every night, I would go to bed in my hotel in Bismarck, North Dakota. And, not every night I was in Bismarck, but you get the point. A random night in Bismarck, North Dakota at the Hilton Garden Inn and wondering, well, is this the night that I wake up in the middle of the night and I have COVID? And imagining, will I be a week or 2 weeks sitting at the Hilton Garden Inn in Bismarck with COVID, or will I end up in the hospital in Bismarck, or what will happen? And so every morning you'd wake up and you're like, okay, I feel good. Let's go. We'll do the next one. And you just kept working it down the line. And I would find things, but it wasn't like the old days where the big massive collections would come in necessarily. It was a lot of $5 here, $10 there, $20 here, and you just pieced it all together. What we had, some really good auctions, really great sales, but it was definitely a more difficult period of time in which to get it. And you had to work. You had to be willing to take the risk, and you had to get out there and work for it. So we had some really great auctions. A couple I remember in the summer of 2020. Now, Europe had really locked down, and you could not fly there. And the unfortunate thing is that I had a major collection in Vienna, Austria, and they were insistent. They wanted to do it now. They wanted to sell. They were motivated, and they wanted me to figure out how to get there. And I'm like, well, Americans, unfortunately, cannot travel to Europe. Even when they started the flights during the summer, like I think it was mid to late July or something, because I was on the very first flight after they reopened the airlines to fly back in between the US and Europe. I recall that Americans still just couldn't randomly travel over there. You had to have unique special permission from the government for essential business. So I talked to this client and said, look, I need a letter of essential business to be able to even enter Austria or Germany or anywhere. And he said, not a problem. And he sent me a letter of official business to visit Austria of national importance for doll research. I was like, this is never going to work. I couldn't believe it, but I was like, all right, I'll try. So I booked a ticket, the first flight to Europe in 3 months. I was on it. It was Austrian Airlines. The airport was chaos because there had been 3 months of people waiting in the U.S. to fly back to Europe that had been stranded there, basically because there were no flights. Everybody had stopped them. So it was absolute chaos. But I managed to get on a ticket for this flight. And I get to the airport and they demand to see my letter of entry into Austria. And I said, this is never going to work. They took the letter, they went into the back room, and they came back and they handed me my boarding pass. I couldn't believe it. I was now on an official trip to Austria of national importance for doll research. And off I went. And Vienna at the time, wow, it was empty. You could walk down the streets and your footsteps on the cobblestone would be the only thing you would hear echoing through blocks. No tourists. People were really not going out much at all. The hotel was unbelievably empty. You needed to do testing like every 3 days. And I remember when I landed, I had to go immediately, was sent into quarantine and tested right away, and then sent to quarantine at my hotel and couldn't come out for 24 hours out of my room. It had, from a business perspective, unbelievable challenges. So that was a little of mine. I know you're all thinking, well, come on, whatever. That's your story. We all had our story. And I get that. Everybody had their own hurdles to jump through and hoops to go through in order to survive or get through the COVID period. But that was some of my story and Theriault's as well. There was a lot of adjustment, and we had to come up with some new ideas, too, in the process of this, because we realized, people are not coming to the auction. It's not just a shift of trends of people wanting to bid online. This was 2 years of studio sales. We need to do other things to engage people. How do we bring them in from their living rooms to a feeling of more understanding, engagement, and relationship with a doll that is not going to match what they might feel if they came? And having that, what my friend in South Carolina, my good collecting friend, Catherine Peterson, has always called the weight of a doll emotion related to their actually being there. How can we get this? How can we mimic this? So we started coming up with ideas like every company did. You had to figure out new ways. We started introducing video conferencing where you could make an appointment in real time to view dolls with one of our staff, have a 365-degree look at under the dresses, the back of the head, the wig, everything. And they became hugely popular. We started increasing the YouTube videos with Florence, which allowed for more engagement and commentary of the dolls, almost like a walkthrough exhibit that you would have for her when you used to come to the auctions. All of these were hugely successful. All of these ideas. We introduced 50 forward auctions where we couldn't have 10 to go sales at that time, which were our live auctions for selling a lot of the entry-level pieces out of collections. We couldn't have those. And because they were specifically live, no internet. So we had to find another angle of which to get some other things into the marketplace. So we came up with 50 Forward, our first ever introduction of timed auctions that are more traditional internet auction bidding styles. And they went wild. People loved it. They had a blast. There was one thing we did that I thought for sure people would love, and nobody took us up on it. We offered what we called, being on my DoorDash frenzy at that period, we offered Doll Dash, which if you bought a doll and you lived within a 50-mile radius, we would do a curbside delivery to you of the doll. I figured people would really like that and could relate to it, kind of Amazon style. Nobody did. They were like, no, just ship it. It's fine. I even called and offered it to a couple people, and they're like, they're 20 miles away. And they're like, no, that's fine. Just ship it to us. It's no big deal. So, okay, that was my one failure, Doll Dash. So we don't do that anymore. Please don't call us for it. But that's a little bit of the background of that 2-year period. And it was quite a change. I think the moment for me when things sort of, life was getting back to the old ways in a new way was when Australia opened up. And this was a big one. It was, I think, February of 22, if I'm not mistaken. They had been closed for over 2 years. And this was a huge thing. And I was waiting and waiting because I literally had 5 large collections of old line Australian collectors that families and the collector themselves had been waiting. I mean, one of them, she's still alive, at the time was 108 years old. And the family was like, we're just hoping they're going to open the doors soon so you can come get the dolls. I mean, she's 108. How much more time do we have? So I was like, I'm trying. But you literally could not fly to Australia. There wasn't even a special permission letter. There was nothing. There was no way. So I waited, and one day, boom, they opened the doors. And I mean, the floodgates went wild. Everybody was flying to Australia. I don't even want to tell you what I had to pay for a ticket to go there at that time. It was insanity. And then at that time, because they had closed literally everything in Australia for 2.5 years, hardly anybody had COVID. So when they opened the floodgates and the world started pouring in, COVID went wild in Australia. And I mean, I was in one appointment after another where 2 days later I would get a call saying, Stuart, we want to let you know we both have COVID. And shockingly, I never got it while I was there. And everybody around me was dropping with COVID left and right, having the courtesy to at least call me. But at that point, most everybody was vaccinated. So the COVID was nowhere near as bad as it was in the beginning. And so shockingly, with all of that travel, with everything that I did, with all that moving around during that time, I didn't even get COVID until September of 23 for the very first time. And it finally happened. And of course, in a hotel, as I always feared. And it was a Hyatt hotel in the Napa Valley area of California. And I woke up with a fever, realized, tested, I had COVID, and ended up spending a week sitting at this hotel, which luckily had a balcony. And I never forget a moment on the second night or third night, I was sitting out on the balcony and I was feeling fine and sitting out on the balcony, and they were playing music in a cafe across the street. And the singer started playing Hotel California. And I'm like, no, not that song, please. No. But that was sort of the journey of Theriault and myself during that period. But what I know you want to know is, what effect did this really have? What happened during COVID with collecting? Well, let me tell you some data on this. You remember I said it was harder to get merchandise, and it was. So the reality is, and then we didn't have our 10 to go auctions. We had cut down the number of sales as well. We also had shipping that was a little bit impeded by supply chain, by staffing. We had to have straddled hours in the shipping department because it's a close-knit area back there where we only wanted one shipper at a time working. So, we had some hurdles internally that we had to go through to meet the demands of wanting to take care of our staff and protect them, and still knowing scalability as far as what we could provide our customers, not wanting to overdo it. So we had to cut back on the number of auctions, but naturally with that, cut back on the number of dolls we were selling, not only for that, but because you couldn't get as many dolls. What is so interesting is we probably sold half the amount of dolls in that period in total in 2020 and 2021, half the amount of dolls, yet our sales increased over 2019. How is that even possible? Because there was a COVID surge like you cannot believe in pricing. It truly was astounding. If you put this data together and understanding half the number of dolls, but sales went up, that would reflect that we were at an increase of about 100% overall in pricing on dolls at that point. This was a massive surge. Now, you might go back and find a few buys here and there were some, and it was especially prevalent on entry-level to mid-level dolls. Now, this is a category, let's call German babies or standard stock German and late French dolls. This was a category that had been kind of languishing prior to COVID. They had been steadily dropping in pricing over the early 2000s, right up until COVID, and over the years, a little bit more dropping down in value. And a lot of this I've talked about in previous podcasts. It was a changing approach to collecting where people were migrating more to less dolls and better higher end pieces. It was eBay coming in and really showing how many of these dolls were actually out there. And it was a glut of them coming onto the marketplace because the great accumulators of the 60s to 90s age that would collect $3,000 and be perfectly happy with 100 Bilos in their collection, they were starting to die in the early 2000s and gradually rolling these things out into the marketplace, and it was just getting saturated. And so the market had been dropping considerably over those 20 years leading up into COVID. And then COVID hit, and suddenly they started spiking up again. We started seeing better pricing. I couldn't believe it. buy lows started bringing $150 again. Some things were doing well. German open mouth dolls were kind of taking off also. So this was really kind of a shocking moment. Now, high end was going up as well, but it really wasn't as dramatic a shift as we saw with the entry to mid level. I would say a significant portion of the increase in sales was happening because those dolls had fallen so much that it was shocking how much they had gone back up during that 2-year period. But it was short-lived. We were not alone in this. I mean, some other statistics that I've read about were eBay reported in that 2020 to 2022 period, they had a 90% increase in sales. I mean, eBay stock was wild at that point, and because their sales were absolutely blowing the roof off. Two of the major marketplace auction platforms, they had reporting at that time that they were surging at 100% and greater in increases. It was all across the board. Every auction house, every major marketplace platform, everybody was showing about 100% increase in sales, all directly related to COVID's surge. So this is an astounding statistic. Now, remember I said earlier that the perception within people who might be wanting to sell their collection or estates who were faced with selling their collection, sadly, many of them didn't, because they just had the idea of thinking that it was COVID times. Why would anybody be buying? But they were. Who were these people? Well, it's not just about who were the people. It's about what happened to collectors during this time. But the first thing that was clearly obvious, and we were seeing the data, we were getting an influx of new collectors like we have never seen before. Now, you always have a steady pace of new collectors that replace those that drop out of collecting or pass away, that are coming in each year into the hobby. And we analyze and watch that to kind of see trends and patterns in our demographics, in our data that we analyze. And yet, when COVID hit, I would say by about June, it was wow. I had never seen this many new collectors, new for us, I should say. They might have been collecting elsewhere before, but they seemed to be primarily new people engaging in the hobby. Now, I talked to a lot of these people over the years since for different reasons, and some of them, it was very interesting. They said, we had always been interested in dolls. We dabbled, let's call it, and yet we never had time. And we were always doing other things. We were traveling, we were working, we were raising our families. And then COVID hit, and everybody at that point was looking for something to do, something that was productive in a way. You were working from home, sure, but you had a lot of other time. And so that's when you heard the stories of everybody was gardening. And well, we saw the story earlier I told of the Chinese seeds, but everybody was crafting and I remember baking. Baking was the huge thing. Oh my gosh. I wonder how much the sales increased of baking tools during COVID must have been through the roof, because everybody was trying something new or something that they enjoyed doing before, but they never had time to really dig in like they did during COVID. So this led to a big influx of new engaged active collectors that we had not seen ever in the past. So that was the really big factor, and leads into also understanding why entry-level pieces were impacted the most at that point, because people were entering kind of into the hobby from the dabbling stage or as brand new collectors. And you all know, as established collectors, you'd kind of enter in through the entry-level gateways and then expand upwards from there. So they were coming in and instantly impacting that entry market. And we saw these big increases. But then there was other factors too that were playing off of this with existing collectors too. People just surprisingly, even though everyone had panicked in the beginning that the economy would collapse, everything would collapse, businesses would shutter, and there were businesses that had difficulty. I mean, I felt terrible for my friends in the restaurant business, but they found ways to survive as well. But the reality is, people had more money. They had a lot more money. They weren't traveling as much. They weren't spending much money on gas because hardly anybody was going out. They weren't spending money, expensive dinners going out in the evening. It was incredible. People would tell me all the time, I just have so much more money right now. And then you started getting stimulus checks and loan pauses. It was an incredible period of a lot of pent up money sitting at home with people who had really nothing else to do in many cases but buy. Just like at Theriault, at Amazon, at eBay, everywhere, everybody showed massive increases. The third reason is one that is probably more emotional. And I did a lot of research and studying this and reading articles about collecting during COVID and why it became such a big thing. And not just collecting, as we talked about, even just baking or gardening or crafting in some form. People were learning to play the guitar again. There was something that was uniquely special and poignant for people during this time to have these productive pursuits, if you will. I've read a lot, and I just recently ordered her book because I've only read articles that she's written in the past and interviews that she's done. But there is a noted doctor in neurology and psychiatry that has written a lot about collectors and analyzing the science behind collecting within the mind. Her name is Shirley Mueller, and I am determined to get her on a podcast soon because I really want to talk to her. And she wrote a book actually that has been well received over the past few years called Inside the Head of a Collector. So her subject comes not just from a science standpoint, but she is, interestingly enough, actually a collector herself. She collects Chinese vases or teapots, I think, that were made primarily for porcelain teapots that were made for the export market and has about 800 of them. So she became interested understanding her own feelings as a collector, how that translates to her research and work in neurology and psychiatry. So she wrote this book, and it's been a really interesting book that's been quoted in a lot of articles over the years. And I just recently finally ordered it because I realized I need to read this book and trying to come to better understanding of what she discovered. Well, she did an interview and she tried to explain why COVID collecting, I guess is how we call it now, offered something to people during this period that was really important. And it comes down to one word: control. Collecting was something they can control. And this was at a period and a time when we couldn't control anything. We had no idea what was going to happen, what was happening, or the level that this would go to. And so people were desperately seeking out some sort of level of control. And I really found that to be a fascinating analysis from an expert onto why the COVID collecting really took off. But I would say that that element of control probably goes even a little bit further. There was one more spark within collecting during COVID that I think resonated with people as an important aspect of something they needed. They wanted nostalgia. They didn't want to be where they were. They wanted to be where they were before. And there's nothing like collecting that takes you back in time to a different period of your life. It's why I talk about music as being one of the greatest triggers of nostalgia that you can find, and why every casino in America has got one 80s or 90s or even 70s act after another of musicians coming on tour, because we love nostalgic music and that feeling when you hear that old song that takes you back to when you were 19 or 20 years old. This is powerful stuff. And it's very healing in a lot of ways, especially if you're going through a difficult time that you cannot control things yourself. You turn to nostalgia, you turn to collecting as a way to control and as a way to go back in time and go to a different period of your life. So one other thing happened collectors tended to be more engaged. They had more time, as we've talked about. And this actually came not as a result necessarily of just being at home anymore, but I talked to a number of these new collectors who came in, and it directly correlated their newfound passion for full-on collecting with the fact that they accelerated their retirement at the beginning of COVID. And you probably read articles about the big surge of people retiring early or deciding to retire and or selling their businesses, moving on because that's it. COVID, they just didn't want to deal with this. They had images of this going on for years, and in some cases it did. And so they decided, you know what? I'm cashing out. I'm done. And so you had a number of people, a lot of people. I think there was a 5.6% increase at that time, something like 1 million more people retiring during COVID than had prior. And so that will throw a lot more people into the collecting mode, because we all know that when you hit retirement, you tend to be far more active and engaged in collecting. You have more time. You have more ability. You're financially at a point where you kind of know where you are and where you're going to be. And so you full on collect. Your biggest collecting years, I always say, are in your 70s. This is when you go wild. And so this accelerated to create yet another dynamic that created the big COVID surge of 2020 to 2022. But it's 2025. It's 3 years now removed from that surge. So did everything go right back to the way it was? Did we get through that period and everything normalize? No. There is no doubt that a new reality, wasn't that what everybody said? It's a new reality or something along those lines during COVID. It stuck. And a lot of things have hung on to become a new way of approaching collecting and a new pattern for collectors to engage in the hobby that is breathtaking in many cases. And so while we talk about the COVID surges and we talk about the COVID craziness of that 2-year period, there's a lot of it that still holds true today and actually created a permanent shift that I don't think we are ever going back to the way it was back in the day. That auction, as I mentioned in 2019, marked the last real moment. We came back in 2023 to start to have audiences again. But the reality is, people didn't want to come back like they did before. Sure, the first one in January of 2023, we had the Sandy Kralovitz collection, and we had a fabulous attendance there, and people were so excited and happy to be engaging again, and at a live event again, and that January auction was filled with so much joy, but you still felt that it was not the same. Something had really, really shifted in the minds of collectors. And then we really saw it in 2024. That 23 moment was probably based more out of, oh, we've been home for a couple of years. This is so great. Let's go to the auction. But 2024 to me was a far more telling moment. Now, I always tell this story because I think it really does clearly display the changes of COVID and the changes over time that were naturally happening before anyway. So in 2003, we held the auction of Mildred Seeley that many of you remember and or have heard about. That was a truly momentous moment in the world of dolls. This was a woman who was absolutely beloved and had shaped doll collecting for multiple generations, was one of the most giving people you can ever imagine to the world of collecting, would welcome any collector into her home any time of the day. Just knock on the door and you can go and enjoy her collection and stay there all day talking dolls with her. Millie was beloved. So when she passed away and we sold her collection, we held the auction in Las Vegas at the Venetian Hotel. And I want to say, we had 500 to 600 people at that event. It was incredible. Flew in from all over the world. And there was so much love and energy and passion in that room that I can still see it and feel it today. Now let's fast forward to 2024. We are now conducting in January at the Scottsdale Camelback Marriott, our classic January big event with another figure who was equally as beloved and equally as impactful to generations of collectors, and that is Rosalie Weil, who stood in her museum for over 20 years and welcomed people from across the world and shared her vision and her dolls and gave so much to the community in research and writing and that museum that was always open for every collector out there. And she was truly, truly as beloved as Millie Sealey. We hold her auction, which became the highest grossing doll auction in world history in January of 24. 85 people came. 600 people came to Mildred Sealey. 85 people came to Rosalie Weil. This was a moment that I knew everything had changed in the world of auctions because it was still the highest grossing auction in world history. So where was everybody? They were online. 90% of the items that were brought down to that auction event came back to Maryland to be shipped out to online bidders. Everybody was engaging online. It was a true moment of understanding that this COVID change for those 2 years of people bidding online, it had stuck. And everybody now preferred to bid from home. Not everybody, but a very large percentage of the collectors out there. I mean, I remember being in the living room of one of these collectors. Her name is Mary. And we were talking because Mary had come to auctions for years, especially the January sale, the convention sale, loved coming to all the events and would socialize with people, have loads of fun, was very happy at these sales. And she stopped during COVID and really never came back, but continued collecting, continued bidding online. But you would have just figured that once things sort of normalized again and we would have these big events that she would return. Well, she came to one, and then that was it. And so I was sitting in her living room, I don't know, maybe a year ago, 6 months ago, and time for me is a vacuum. I have no idea where I was 2 weeks ago. So I don't know if that's accurate, but somewhere along those lines. And anyway, so I was sitting there with Mary, and I said, Mary, why don't you come anymore? You still actively bid. You still love collecting. You are still as happy as can be getting a new item, but you used to love to come to the sales. Why not? And she said, in COVID and after COVID, I just got so used to bidding from home, and it's really comfortable. I have you on the big high definition screen, which God help me, you have to see me on that screen in high definition. That's quite a prominent forehead to look at. And, she said, I got my big comfortable chair. I've got my dog sitting here next to me. I've got my coffee pot within reach. I always joke, she didn't say this, but I always joke, got your bottle of tequila right next when you lose a doll, you can take a shot. She said, oh, yes, all of these things. It's so comfortable here. It's so wonderful. And she said, and the best thing of all I found out, the best thing I learned was everybody minds their own business when I'm bidding from home. I've told this story before, but this really does ring true as to the underlying X factor of why people are enjoying bidding online. It's why you see people, they'll come to the auction, they'll come to the exhibit, and they'll go back to their rooms and they'll bid online or go home and bid online, or they'll sit in the crowd and bid online. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts, but it's important to reintroduce it here to understand how COVID did this. COVID created this change, and it made people realize that they actually prefer less chatter. They actually prefer doing their own thing. And it has resulted in more active bidding on the mid to higher end range because there's less chatter of people talking and judging and telling, why did you bid against me and all of these things? And I can't believe you paid that much for that doll. And so it's opened the market up to being a little bit more anonymous and making people, a lot of people, far more comfortable in doing what they want to do and not having to listen to the chatter of others. And this mindset of cocooning really has set into society. People have rediscovered the idea of home being a comfortable place, and you can do so much from home now. A lot of people are even just working from home now, that home-based activities are a thing. People don't need the socializing in the community as much as they used to. The other thing is that post-COVID inflation really made travel so expensive. Hey, I'm dealing with it all the time, and it's still out there. It has never come back to reality. Once that COVID revenge travel took on and things started going up in price, and the Hampton Inn in Topeka, Kansas was $400 a night during the really big COVID revenge period. It was insanity. Travel got so expensive that a lot of people are just like, for the cost of my going to that auction, spending a weekend there, flying home, flights, car, Uber, whatever, food, hotels, all of it, I could buy an extra doll. And it's so easy from home that why not? And then the other thing is that as we learned during COVID to introduce all of these ways to engage with collectors, that they discovered and found out that they can really see the dolls, and no, it's not quite the same as seeing it in person, but it's pretty darn close anymore, especially when you have quality photographs, quality engagement online with YouTube videos, the ability to video conference, to look at an item more closely from your home, the increase in technology that, for example, our platform, which was custom built for us, allows in resolution during the auction, better sound. You really feel kind of like you're there. It's really close to the experience. And we try to make people feel comfortable as if they're there and allowing this. So that has given people another reason why they don't feel they need to come anymore. Florence and I have debates over this all the time. Florence definitely is from the older school, but I get it. She believes that there's nothing that compares to being there in person and engaging with other collectors in the community. And I see that. I realize it's a big part of collecting, but a lot of people are embracing community online now. They don't necessarily need to be there in person. And you're seeing this with doll clubs. In addition, that you have a number of doll clubs that during COVID, interestingly, started doing Zoom meetings. And then when they went back to in-person doll club meetings, they left the Zoom meetings going, which I love, and became sort of a hybrid form. That is, you could come to the meeting in person, or you could be at home on Zoom and engage with everyone at the meeting from your living room. And this is fabulous for mobility challenge doll club members, people who just really don't go out all that often, or with younger collectors who don't have time, have jobs, they don't have time to be rushing to a doll club meeting after work, whatever, and they just want to go home. They can still engage in the doll club meeting from home. So this also introduced that, and people are finding out that, hey, even community can be had from a distance. So this is all COVID changed. It is sticking. It's not going back to 2019 and that Ritz-Carlton in Santa Barbara. So what about the doll market? Interestingly enough, as we talked about, the COVID 20 to 22 surge was just that. It was 2 years. Now, I mentioned before, it didn't really have a massive effect on mid-range to higher-end market. That actually remained fairly consistent, maybe a little increases here and there in certain categories. Small dolls took on a whole new level of consciousness during COVID, and it has stuck to be one of the hottest markets going for sure. People really do love small, but a lot of that wasn't really COVID driven. I think that shift was happening already as collectors were looking for more targeted, more manageable collections that could be easily moved if you had to move later in life. So that had a lot of effect on the small, but there was definitely not as much of an impact to that mid to high range. Where the impact really took hold, as we mentioned before, was the entry level to mid. That's where the market during COVID absolutely exploded, and you saw things bringing 2 to 3 times more than it had pre-COVID. Well, after the surge, about 2022, a little bit into maybe June of 2022, you started seeing that market absolutely starting to fall back. And it fell back hard because, as we mentioned before, you then had a lot of the people who had held back collections during those 2 years in COVID, now all wanting to sell their collection at the same time, and everything coming out into the market. And a lot of those collectors who were buying in the entry level that didn't expand on and evolved from there. They kind of got stuck in there. They were instant enthusiasm collectors. And once the COVID years ended and people went back to work, went back to their lives, went back to doing other things, they kind of dropped out as well. And so you saw that market take a big hit, probably the most significant hit we've seen in any particular category. And I would say it's dropped even further than we saw pre-COVID. That would be that entry level. Hey, I don't mean to sound negative. I mean, it's a reality. I'm not sharing something that I don't think anybody out there who's engaged in the world of dolls doesn't know. What I will say on a positive angle to this, where you see drops and you see falling, it's not going to go any further. There's very little room left to go down on those particular entry level basic stock model babies, as an example. What I see is opportunity. They are a great buy for a lot of collectors out there, especially if you love sewing, costuming, any of these things. You have an incredible opportunity to buy a lot of antique classic dolls that are beautiful to look at, have a story to tell, and are outrageously affordable right now, less than some new dolls in a store you go to buy. So it is a great opportunity to jump in if you're a new collector. Great way to start to kind of dabble in the market, get a feel for it. You're not going to risk much money. You'll start to understand the complexities and the nuances of dolls and how to identify the faces. And for those of you who bought them during COVID, hey, it's okay. It's fun. You had fun. You had a good time. A lot of you spent $5,000 to go for 4 days to Hawaii in COVID revenge travel, and it's probably $800 now. That's all right. You had fun. You needed to do it at the time, and it made you happy. As I said, during COVID, and the analysis from Dr. Shirley Mueller, who said that COVID was about control, it served a purpose at the time for a lot of people. So even if you got out of collecting after COVID, it was there for you then, and you can come back later on and enjoy it in the future as you get more time and ability to collect. The good thing is a lot of people came in during COVID and they've actually stayed, and they've stayed in the marketplace. They discovered dolls during this time, or they re-engaged in something they dabbled in a little bit in the past, and they've actually stuck and become great collectors. And they're now experiencing what I call, always in every episode, the happy life of a collector that came out of COVID. So there were silver linings during what was a really difficult time. And that is a beautiful thing to remember, that no matter what we go through in our lives, I've seen it all over my years. I've seen recessions. I saw the Great Recession, 9/11, so many different, very powerful, emotional, historical occurrences happened that collecting became a solace. It became a refuge for many people. And that is one of the joys of collecting, and why having the happy life of a collector is so important. And I think COVID is a perfect display of how people turn to it to give them comfort, to give them a sense of control, to be there in a difficult time. Why we saw those changes, and we do understand now it shifted many patterns that are permanent for the future and will be the new face of collecting, but that's okay. It's good. It's positive. We're on the right track. We're all going to find a path, and doll collecting is a beautiful and wonderful way to get through some of the most difficult times in your life.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media, and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault, or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriault.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.